All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Vigderman. I'm here from Baseball Info Solutions, and I'm here to talk about a subject that has been sort of popping around in the office over the off season, and that's the building blocks of projecting defensive performance. It's something that, as the purveyors of defensive runs saved, we do every year, but also we're looking for opportunities to improve upon it. And it's not necessarily a topic that people talk about too much in the public sphere, so we kind of wanted to just sort of go through the kinds of things that we think of and that we're thinking of going forward in terms of improving our process for this. So first, obviously, it's worth talking about why we're talking about defensive projections. Again, like I said, it's not exactly something that we think about too much in the public sphere. And in order to really talk about something from a projections perspective, first you have to sort of establish that it's a phenomenon that has year-to-year consistency, especially considering sort of the perception about defensive metrics compared to offensive and pitching statistics. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. And then just some other considerations for projection from a defensive perspective. So that'll include converting stats from the minor leagues to the major leagues, any aging effects, and also the relative value of different positions. So first off, why defensive projections? There are lots of private and public defensive or public projection systems, and most of those center on hitting and pitching. And that makes sense because the betting industry and fantasy industries drive public interest in these sorts of things. And so defense ends up sort of third banana from that perspective. Although as a person who works for a company that does defensive metrics, we do defensive runs saved based fantasy leagues, and that ends up being a nice sort of alternative to your usual fantasy angle. Beyond a lack of fantasy implications, there is, again, like I mentioned, an understandable lack of interest in the defensive side of things because there are concerns about its reliability, and we'll get to that as well. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that defensive value is a relatively small but still meaningful portion of player and team value. So if you exclude the positional adjustment of WAR, which again also includes some value of defense, but if we're just talking about the defensive runs saved or UZR, if you're talking about Fangraphs or Baseball Reference WAR, the portion of defense that goes into the total WAR is about 1/8 on average. And so is relevant for player evaluation. It's also relevant for season evaluation. So if you're in the business of win total projections or playoff odds or any of that sort of thing, it's important to get these sorts of things right, especially when you're talking about team stats, because when you're bundling up defensive run save numbers, for example, you're talking about potentially 100 runs over the course of a season. So just to give a little slightly more concrete idea of what the value of accuracy would be, if you were to project a player to save 5 runs and instead he costs 5 runs, that's a 10-run differential, and that's the difference of roughly a win. And you can think of that as the impact on his statistical record, the impact on his potential value relative to his salary, and then also just generally the value to his team. And that's not exactly a huge amount when you sort of look at those numbers, but the impact can be relatively large. And then if you bundle a bunch of much smaller differences in terms of error in projection for an entire team, so let's say that you measured a team's efficiency by 30 runs off. So if you said they were going to be saving 50 runs and instead they saved 20 runs, then suddenly we're talking about 2 to 3 wins, and then you're turning division winners into teams that are fighting for wild cards, or teams that are fighting for wild cards into teams that aren't really contending for the playoffs at all by the end of the season. So like I mentioned, in order to be able to project something, it needs to have some degree of consistency. So you wouldn't want to build a projection system around coin flips because there's no consistency from coin flip to coin flip in terms of the results. There needs to be some degree of stability for it to be worth looking into projecting something. And to take this in a different angle, a big reason for the increase in relevance of defense independent pitching and hitting statistics is because strikeouts and walks are very consistent over time between both pitchers and hitters. So how does defense compare to the pitching and hitting side? So here we have 2 tables, one for offense and one for pitching, that show the year-to-year correlations of stats over the last 7 years. So this top half is basically just stats taken from like the advanced tab on Fangraphs, for example. There are obviously more advanced statistics on both sides of the ball, but these are ones that certainly are in the general vocabulary of people here. So you can see that the year-to-year correlations for those offensive statistics are pretty consistent with one another, and they're a little bit higher than the more basic pitching statistics. And then as you add in those defense independent components, the strikeout, walk, and home run rates, FIP gets much better than the other two, and XFIP gets even better, and that's because it's essentially isolating the value of those most projectable elements. On the bottom here, we have the defensive side of things. So per 1,000 inning DRS, on the left side, we have the previously existing defensive run saved system. So Brian and Mark talked yesterday about the new system that we're implementing, but the previous system had pretty strong year-to-year correlations, essentially equivalent with the offensive side of things. And in our new system, the year-to-year correlations are pretty similar. The differences there, it might be a little bit lower, but generally we're talking about things that are at about the same level once you consider sort of random variation and that sort of thing. The obvious question you should have from looking at this is, we improved defensive runs saved, so why isn't it more stable? Particularly because when we improved the system, we tried to remove factors that are outside of the player's control. And so in theory, from year to year, if you're removing factors outside of the player's control, then you should have a little bit more stability over time. The real result of that is, or the reason for that, is that contextual factors tend to stay the same for most players. Most players stay on the same team, and they have the same coaching staff, and all those sorts of things. And so while there are factors outside of that player's control, those factors tend to stay relatively stable. So let's isolate players who switch teams, and people who saw Brian's and Mark's presentation will be familiar with this result. These are year-to-year correlations of the DRS components, specifically the ones that we're implementing with this new system. So positioning, air balls, range, and throwing over the last 7 years. And you can see at the top here that the positioning runs saved, the drop-off from players on the same team to players who switch teams is quite high. And especially compared to the drop-off, and there is a little bit for each of those other components of art run saved. But the overall result, that art run saved that's now going to be part of defensive run saved on various websites that you're looking at, it means that you're getting no drop-off in performance, or in terms of year-to-year consistency between players who stay on the same team and players who switch teams. And comparing that to the previous system, there was a bit more of a drop-off in the past, partially because it was still including that positioning component. So now that we sort of established that there's value, at least in projecting it, just because there's about comparable consistency in terms of defensive metrics compared to pitching and hitting, what other considerations are there when we want to project these sorts of things? So the first couple elements we'll talk about are similar to the way that we would handle batting and pitching. The first is converting stats from the minor leagues to the major leagues, and the second is age. And then there's another element that is unique to the way that we would evaluate defense, and that is that there are different expectations by position, and we'll get into that. So converting minor league stats. Unlike with pitching and hitting, where the quality of your opponent is very relevant, the pitchers you're facing if you're a hitter, the hitters you're facing if you're a pitcher, are very important in terms of determining the kinds of stats you should expect to see from players at different levels of competition. On a batted ball by batted ball basis, defensive metrics kind of don't need to worry about that. A ball that's hit at a certain velocity in a certain direction, where players standing in a particular location, those plays are roughly the same regardless of what level you're playing at. The quality of the playing surface might be a little bit different. The frequency at which you see more difficult batted balls will definitely be different, but on a batted ball by batted ball basis, it's kind of the same evaluation. And so as a result, we can express defensive runs saved on the same scale for minor leagues and major leagues. So when we talk about minor league defensive runs saved, a 0 in the minor leagues is the same as a 0 in the major leagues. So if you are average at one level, you're average at another level. That essentially means that most minor league teams end up with strongly negative defensive run save totals because most players are below average. Obviously, when we're talking about converting to the major leagues, with any translation like that, we should expect some degree of regression, both in terms of regression to the mean and also reduced performance in terms of their actual performance as the players adjust to the league. But outlier performances in particular, we found quite predictive in terms of their results their first year in the major leagues. So we'll talk about catchers in a second and how they sort of relate a little differently. But if we filter out the catchers for a second and just talk about the 8 times we've seen a player get at least 15 defensive runs saved per 1,000 innings, where they played at least 350 innings in the minors in 1 year, and then 350 innings in the majors in the next year. And so this list of players is going to be familiar to everybody in here, and most of the players on here are known for having pretty good defensive ability. You can see that actually Jackie Bradley Jr. appears here twice because he was called up more than once and performed well in both of those call-ups. Worth noting that, so those guys had excellent seasons in the minor leagues before their call-up, and then after their call-up proceeded to have pretty good seasons for the most part, but also aside from Matt Chapman in 2017 to 2018, most of them did have a fairly substantial drop-off once they hit the major leagues. To look at this at a more holistic league-wide level, here is a comparison between the year-to-year correlations between consecutive major league seasons and between a minor league season followed by a major league season, again with that sort of quarter of a season threshold to qualify. And here we're splitting it up by all the different defensive runs saved components. So I highlighted some of the ones that are the most interesting and I want to talk about, and the rest of them are those other components that make up the. So I mentioned catchers before. Strike zone runs saved is our primary catcher metric. It's how we measure catcher framing. And you can see that the consistency year over year is quite high, regardless of what level you're talking about. And that's what drives catcher value. And that's the reason why I excluded the catchers from the previous analysis, because there are plenty of catchers who have succeeded in the minor leagues and then proceeded to succeed in the major leagues. At the bottom here, you see positioning. And you can see that the value of positioning year over year is a little bit less consistent for sure from the majors to the majors, but in terms of minors to majors conversion, there is essentially no relationship. And so we should try to be stripping out the positioning value, because when we're talking about converting from the minor leagues to the major leagues, positioning has essentially no relevance. And you can see some of that impact in terms of comparing the part runs saved to the total runs saved, because part runs saved, which is that part that technically this would be art runs saved in terms of the actual calculation. So it removes that positioning component, and the consistency is essentially equivalent between the minor leagues and the major leagues. Whereas the total, again, still high in terms of year-to-year correlation, but there is a bit of a drop-off because there's these other components that for the most part are falling off in terms of consistency in the minor leagues. Aging effects. As you might not be surprised to find out, players don't really improve over time defensively. They are roughly as good as they're going to be from day one. That's primarily because athleticism is a crucial aspect of defensive performance. This is particularly relevant for outfielders. So they're more likely to decline year over year than other players. And again, we have a special case with catchers where there is a high value of experience in terms of game handling and framing, but there's also a high level of physical attrition. And so they're going to fall off as they get older, potentially faster than other players. So here is a sort of smoothed out aging curve for players by position group from the last 7 seasons. So at the top here, you'll see the infielders curve. In the middle is the catchers curve. And at the bottom is the outfielders. So as I mentioned, the outfielders are the ones who essentially start declining as soon as they make it. And this is by age. So if you were called up at age 25, for example, you might already have passed your best seasons defensively. In terms of catchers, they're able to sustain a little bit of value and maybe get a tiny bit of an improvement as they get a little bit older into their mid-20s, but then the drop-off is just as fast for catchers as it is for outfielders once you get to that late 20s, 30s range. As for infielders, the performance does actually, at the very least, stabilize for quite some time, and there might be some improvement, and certainly there will be plenty of players who will improve over the first few years in the major leagues. And then the decline starts more in the 30 range, whereas the other positions start declining more in the mid-20s. So the relative value of positions is the aspect that is unique to the way that we talk about defense, because players, what we compare players to average at their position for the most part, because that's just the way that it's easier to make these computations that way. And so a player who is a 0 at shortstop, we should expect to be better than a player who is a 0 at third base. And so when a player moves to a new position, when they play a position they haven't played before, or they're switching between positions, how should we expect him to perform now that he's at this other position? So in order to try and get at that question, we can use performance of players in the past who have played multiple positions over a given time period. That could be a case where a player played an entire season at first base and then switched to left field the next season, or, for example, players who just alternate between those two depending on what the team needs at that particular point. So we're looking at, over a 2-year span, did you play at least a quarter of a season at one position and a quarter of a season at another position? And just to deal with some small sample problems potentially, we're going to weight each player position pair by the lower of the 2 innings totals. So if you went between first base and left field and you had 350 innings at first base and you had 1,000 innings in left field, your contribution to this calculation would be just the 350 innings worth, because we don't want to overvalue players who had a relatively lower amount of innings at a given position. So to give an example of what this might look like, let's compare first base to other positions. So what these stats are based on are players who, at some point over a 2-year span, switched between first base and these other 4 positions. I didn't include all the rest of them, primarily because the sample of other position switches is quite small. So switching from first base to second base, for example, we had 15 players who were alternating between those 2 positions. And when they were evaluated at second base, they were about 7 runs per 1,000 innings worse at second base than they were at first base. It's not necessarily that they were playing worse, it's that relative to the other players at that position, they look 7 runs worse. And comparing that to third base, it's a little easier. And so that looks like more -5 runs. And then the corner outfielder positions are about 2 runs more difficult than first base, essentially. Looking at shortstop, you can see that most players, if they're going to switch from shortstop to another position, it's going to be second base. And when they play second base, they get about a 4-run boost per 1,000 innings when evaluated against other second base. That boost is about the same when they go to third base. And in the relatively rare cases in which there is a player who plays both shortstop and center field, that difference is almost non-existent. And so those positions are essentially at the top of the food chain in terms of the defensive spectrum. One thing that's definitely worth pointing out here is that when we're looking at second base and third base, when comparing to shortstop, that difference is essentially the same. We're talking about 4 runs easier when we're looking at second base and third base compared to shortstop. When comparing it to first base, that difference is different, for lack of a better phrase. There is a larger difference between first base and second base than first base and third base. So it's important to understand that there is a sort of non-transitivity between the sort of comparisons between positions. And so while we would like to have this sort of linear defensive spectrum where I have the one position followed by another position followed by another position in a straight line, really there's a sort of fluid relationship there because certain skills translate to other positions a little easier. And there's just not going to be this straight line. That said, I'm going to present you with a straight line just to sort of frame what we just talked about. So this is, again, a rough schematic of the relative value of positions. And the scale is about 8 or 9 runs per 1,000 innings from the top to the bottom. And so center field and shortstop end up at the top of the spectrum here. Then there's a pretty big jump to any other position. And then second and third base come up next, followed by the corner outfield spots, followed by first base. And you can see that catcher is sort of off to the side here, and it's kind of fuzzy, and that's intentional because there are just so few opportunities to find players switching from catcher to any position other than first base. And so we can have a pretty decent understanding of how catchers compare to first basemen, and they're about in that second base range, maybe a little bit higher. But because there aren't too many cases of players switching to other positions from catcher, we don't really have a way to place them on this scale. Although obviously we would feel pretty confident that if anything, they might be a little bit higher. That said, the skill set for catcher is so unique that players who can switch between them might not be as much of a difference there, but because the value of having a catcher who can play for entire seasons is so much because of that attrition, there is more value placed on the position, even more than what you would see from this scale. Just to give a quick example of how we might sort of use these components in action, we'll talk about Mookie Betts, who was just traded from the Red Sox to the Dodgers. And he played his entire career in right field for the most part, and now is going to a team who has their own MVP right fielder in Cody Bellinger. And so you could see Betts playing plenty of center field. So what could Betts do if the Dodgers just decided to move him to center field in 2020? Using a Marcel estimate that's just sort of a weighted average leaning on the most recent season and going back 3 years, if we use that estimate of his runs saved and his innings, that would suggest that he would play about 1,200 innings and would save about 20 runs in right field were he to play there. The conversion from right field to center field would be about -9 runs saved. And so that's just because it's more difficult, and that's scaled to that 1,230 innings as opposed to the per 1,000 innings we saw earlier. And then aging from 26 to 27, maybe he'd be a little bit worse, again, because outfielders tend to decline much faster, but generally we're talking about not much of a change. And so the expected result for Mookie playing a full season in center field would be about 11 runs saved. So that's pretty much all for me. Just wanted to acknowledge our BIS video scouts who collect so much of the data that we're using for this purpose. And are spending a lot of effort doing that, although not so much in the last couple of weeks necessarily. Thanks to John Dewan, who's the CEO of the company and who's constantly keeping us going in terms of getting ideas to try and advance our knowledge of baseball. Thank you to the BIS R&D team, particularly the recently departed Andrew Kine, who laid a lot of the groundwork for the calculations that were used in this and sort of set the basis for this presentation. And to SABR and you guys for allowing me to present. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I'll be available. You can send me an email or anything like that.